Hi lads, thanks for tuning into the podcast again. Don't forget to like and subscribe and head over to the Patreon to contribute and help us out. Thanks a million and enjoy the podcast. Hello everybody and welcome back to the Norries podcast. I'm your host James Emmett, joined by my good friend Timmy Long.
Hi everyone.
Rowan is on the deck. Say hi Rowan.
Hi Rowan.
And I'm to the left of Timmy.
So I keep getting stick over moving my head to the right talking to James, and a well-known personality gave out to me over it, so we have to listen to this man, and we switched.
So I hope we took Christy Moore's advice on board. So like I always said, like, no, if I was sitting here I'd never let that happen. Oh fuck, I forgot all about it there for a second. I'm only joking. We'll horse into it, yeah. Dr. Jo-Hanna Ivers, an academic from Trinity College, Dublin. Mm-hmm. You're very welcome to Cork City and on the Norries podcast.
Thanks for having me, James.
Thanks for coming down. It's a beautiful evening, isn't it?
It's lovely, yeah. And I was leaving Dublin today and it was actually really foggy and rainy, and anyway, I was completely dressed wrong, but there you go.
No, but the reason you were asked to come on this podcast is because you're a great advocate for those in recovery with regards to your research.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got into that field of research and where you're from, where you grew up?
Yeah. So the two of them kind of come together. I'm from the North Inner City in Dublin. I'm from Shamrock Street, and I suppose I grew up with lots of drug use around me. You know, people I loved, people I went to school with, people in my community on, you know, using drugs and becoming addicted. So I learned very early on, and I guess I built an empathy for drug use and drug users. And I suppose that goes back to me knowing the why. I knew, because I was living in poverty with, you know, adverse, you know, early life events, trauma, lots of mental health issues, high levels of crime, high levels of police brutality and stuff like that, structural violence. So, you know, institutions that are supposed to look after us that are actually keeping us down or creating barriers to access. So I understood all of that. That's the language we have now. I wasn't calling it that at the time. And as kind of cheesy as it sounds, I kind of from a very early age wanted to change that. Wanted a different way for me, but I also wanted a different way for the people I loved and knew and knew were suffering. And so I always worked in addiction. Initially I started out, so I trained, I'm a psychologist by background, and then I trained in addiction kind of clinical areas, getting into the HSC then, and my main job was assessing people for treatment, getting them into treatment, and that's what I thought, listen, I've landed a dream job now. I'm actually helping people who want to get treatment, and now they're getting places and they're coming out and they have plans. And again, we use the words care plans, making goals with people, like. Yeah. And that was going well for a while, and I, as I say, was in addiction services, so I kind of felt like, right, making the changes I want. And I learned then after a while that, you know, it was all about addiction, or it was all about detox and treatment and harm reduction, and there wasn't a whole lot about recovery at the time. So people were going into treatment, they built this plan for 2 years, and then they were coming out to very little. And I never forget, it was December 2008, and I was working in Ballymun, and 5 people died in the lead up to Christmas, and I thought, this is wrong. Like, you know, initially I thought I was doing well, and I thought we're keeping people alive, and obviously that's very important, but at this stage in the game I kind of thought, well, you know what, actually now we're not that effective either. And I kind of got this curiosity and this drive to want to know more. And I kind of realised quickly that actually I have to understand this from a different perspective. There has to be more. And in parallel, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but in parallel we've all known about the fellowships and the effects of the fellowships and people, you know, staying abstinence and all the rest. So that was kind of working parallel to the treatment system. But I and it was a bit of a serendipitous moment, a bit of a lucky strike, where I was working in a clinic, and a group of researchers headed up by a Corkonian, Joe Barry, who was a big deal in Trinity. He was going to understand, trying to drill into this post-detox, what can we gain from aftercare. So I joined his team and I thought, right, I'll understand this from a population level. And that's where I work now. I work in the Institute of Population Health in the School of Medicine in Trinity. And my job really is to research from a population level. And my program of research looks at, it's quite broad, it's biological. I'm also trained in neuroscience and neuroimaging and things like that. So I wanted to understand addiction from that spectrum, from a bio-psychosocial, and I thought I knew the environment quite well. So it was about combining all of that. So that's the who I am and where I am at now.
So when you spoke about there, back in the day it was about detoxing people, getting people into residential, but there was very little afterwards. Is the concept of recovery something that's a kind of a recent phenomena, or has that not always been there?
Yeah, it's a great one. I think the concept is not at all new. You're living proof of that. People we know that are 50 years in recovery is not new. The language is new, and how we're starting to look at it is new. And I think the history in the US is much better in terms of outcomes and people being a recovery community, if you like. And the UK. And I think there's a couple of things going on. One of which is something that I would have heard you talk about, and that is, fellowship is great. And, there's a group in Harvard Medical School, John Kelly's group, who's producing a huge amount of science on, and Bill White and all those people, David Best, on, why fellowship works and all the rest of it. But actually, fellowship was working, as you say, for hundreds of years, but everybody was told to keep quiet about it, keep your head down, say nothing, anonymous. The anonymity thing, and don't be representing it. And I think what's flipped on its head is that difference, where we now need people like you, and we need people like Timmy, and we need podcasts like this, because what recovery means now is we need to have people visible in the community so that it instills hope on the people coming up. Like the way the fellowship is, but it's no longer a secret. It's no longer bad to talk about it. It's almost like being out and proud and role modelling. And that's why the peer stuff is so important. But I think from a structural perspective, from the system, so from the service to the policy makers, to the decision makers, all the way up to the politicians. What they got hung up on, and it goes back to my earlier point, is that all we could see was detox and rehabilitation. And everybody, and I think that's our problem from a structures perspective, that we need to change that, because yes, treatment is great, but treatment does two things. It either reduces harm or it takes the drugs away. So it's harm reduction or it's abstinence. Rehabilitation is about giving somebody insight into their behaviour, so that their outcomes will be better. Look at your thinking, look at your behaviour, change your life. But it's very individual. What we haven't done is made that transition from a systemic or from a systems point of view. So again, services, politicians, all that. We haven't embraced recovery the way the peers in recovery have, like yourselves. We haven't kind of, from a systems level, supported that. And I think the crudest way, or the clearest way to look at that is we have a national drug strategy that looks at reducing harm and supporting recovery. And again, on a very basic level, probably 90% of services are reducing harm. And 10% are supporting recovery. And I'm a big, I work very closely with services, have a good relationship. I like to think that my research is translational. So in other words, I take the data, I understand the story, and then I give it back to the service. And I've been quite good at making changes at a service level and at a policy level. So I'm not bashing the services, but I think what services have done in the last 10 years is they've just rebranded. So they're using words like recovery, but actually what they mean is treatment and rehabilitation.
The recovery can be very confusing for certain people.
Yeah.
You know, my understanding of recovery is recovering from trauma. It's recovering from trauma from childhood. It's recovering from trauma that was caused during addiction and caused during all different things that happen during addiction, prison, violence, crashes in cars and bikes and all these. They're all forms of different trauma, you know, and grieving for people. Like a lot of people, when they stop drinking and drugging, they start realizing that they have to grieve for a loved one that they never got the chance to, because they numb themselves completely with drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
You know?
And to me, like, recovery to me is more than abstinence from drinking drugs.
100%.
Recovery to me is you do the residential, right, if you want that, or you do your psychotherapy and all that, and hopefully you get to a place where you're abstinent. That's the holy grail. But that's when the work starts. The recovery piece is doing the 12 steps, if that's what you want to do, doing the meditation, the psychotherapy, addressing the behaviours, because that's, like, if you want to maintain abstinence long term, you have to recover and do the recovery piece. But one thing you touched on there, and I couldn't agree more, was the services that they talk about recovery, but they don't live recovery.
Absolutely.
You know, like, the detox and the residential is only one part of it. But in Cork, for a long time, we'd be very neglected with any aftercare service. We had no day programs in Cork up until in the last couple of weeks, and at that they're only starting, which I'm working on.
Yeah.
But at least there's something now, do you know what I mean? We have no aftercare homes, only for one or two that the Simon have. There's one in the Coonford, I have one as well. But all this stuff was all Dublin centric, you know, even for Cork people leaving any of the services up along like the treatment centre in Cork is thousands, like 8 grand to 15,000.
Yeah.
A lot of Cork people always going to Dublin, always staying on in Dublin for the aftercare, staying on in Dublin for the recovery homes, so we don't have the recovery piece, or at least we're way behind Dublin in terms of that. So I agree that we call ourselves recovery.
What's one of the biggest things of relapse? One of the biggest things of relapse is boredom, right? When people come out of residential care, they go straight into their natural environment, the same environment that they were in before they went into treatment. There might be alcoholism in the family home through a sibling or a parent or whoever, doesn't matter, or a partner, and they're staying at home. They may have no job because they've lost it before they went into treatment. There's no form of aftercare, as in, like, where do we pit people? No, it's the same with prisoners. When prisoners come out of prison and they're sober and they're clean and they really want to, but they go right back into that environment where there's a lot of chaotic fucking behaviours and drug addiction and alcoholism and crime. There's no chance.
Because even in criminology, they call that process desistance.
Yes.
Like, you stopped committing the crime. Now, how do you stop it for a very long time? Forever. That's desistance. The exact same thing as recovery. But
that's the nub of it. That's the nub of it, James. So if you think about it, as I say, the first step is treatment, and treatment is absolutely part of recovery, because, like I say, you're either stabilizing a person or they are wanting to be abstinent, and that's brilliant. The rehabilitation piece then is them getting the insight, as you say, maybe engaging with 12 steps, starting to, embrace a faith or do something or whatever works for the individual. But the next level to that is this framework that we've spoken about before, which is called recovery capital. So it goes to the heart of what you just said, Timmy, which is, what are the things that we need to do to ensure that recovery or the treatment and the rehabilitation becomes sustainable? And that's what recovery is, when you sustain the outcomes that you've done in treatment and on yourself. And so we have this framework called recovery capital, and at its fundamental, or at its basic, is it means the assets you have in your life that keep you on the straight and narrow. So that's connection, relationships, building up relationships, getting opportunities to training, building a trade, going on to education, engaging in employment, engaging with your community, giving back to society, having a better quality of life. And that goes to the heart of your other problem with it is this notion that, you know, we measure recovery in this country with two things. Time. So if somebody is 10 years in the fellowship, then they've a stauncher recovery than me. But actually, I could be on 20 mils of methadone, contributing to my community, gone back to college, reconnected with me children. And, you know, it's that level that we really should be looking at for people, and not just this, you're not taking drugs anymore and you're building on this time. It has to be meaningful for people. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And I think we've all met the person that's white knuckling recovery 20 years in. The behaviours haven't changed. They're angry fuckers, and they're a member of a particular organisation that keeps them straight, but they're not living recovery for themselves. It's not a judgment. It's a better way of life, because recovery, as you say, whether it's from childhood trauma or addiction, then it should be about building a more meaningful life, a better quality of life for yourself.
I also think some of the different organisations like NAA and all these different things, I think there's so many people cross-addicted at the moment. I think that they should be all the one, because still the programme, but all the newer generation, they're not just alkies. Like, there's drugs, there's gambling, there's sex, there's overeating, there's so many different things. It's not the one anymore. And some people mightn't feel comfortable going into an AA meeting and speaking about drugs or gambling, because there might be, no, this is no disrespect to anybody.
Of course.
This is the reality of it. There might be a lad that's in there 30 years and he's an AA alcoholic, and he doesn't like the thoughts of someone that's addicted to drugs talking at an AA meeting. And that's a problem for some people. And I know young men that have walked out of rooms, AA rooms, and felt worthless. And I'm sure there has been people that have walked out and went using because of the treatment that inside the meeting, and that's the reality of it. It's not me judging anybody.
You'd even get it in other meetings as well, where let's say if you've somebody that come into the fellowship, right, and their life is destroyed, the smoking cannabis, the life now isn't destroyed, the mental health is gone, the job is gone, the relationship is gone, but a feeling of being dismissed by other people that maybe use harder drugs, So that's why I think if you had something like it was just Addiction Anonymous, it was all encompassing, because all the differences really is the particular substance you're using, but at the crux of it, we're all the exact same people, or they all have the same problems. We find it hard to manage life. And we spoke with a probation officer here before, and we were talking about people that she was working with on probation. They're not committing crime anymore. They're not using as much drugs as they used to be, but they're not happy. They're not as bad as they used to be, but they're not as good as they could be. But they're missing that recovery capital piece. They're missing the connection, they're missing the fun, the fulfillment, the education, the training, and all that piece. It's so important. And we all know people in recovery multiple years, but never really progressed on in their lives.
And that's the sad part of it. The recovery for me, as I said earlier, is recovering from that. It's to be in a certain place in your life that James or Timmy can deal with the stuff of their past that they would have drank on before.
Yeah.
And they don't need an AA meeting, they don't need an NA meeting, they don't need a psychiatrist or a psychologist. They have already dealt with all these issues, and when something comes up from the past, that they can sit back and say, it's okay, this is okay, and feel it and surrender into it and go with it and try to stay out of their head. No, that happened to me through meditation. I saved my life. Yeah. Without a shadow of a doubt. People within AA, they were like angels, guardian angels to me. They were, I'll be eternally grateful, because of the help I got. But we're going into new times. We're going into new times where addiction is across the board, everything, you know, and we need to be more open-minded, you know, and I think there should be more of an emphasis on outside help, you know, outside help, therapy. I don't think the 12 steps is fantastic. It's one of the best things ever, you know. You have a look at your life,
and it's free.
It's free.
There's no way in this.
But there's a lot of deeper stuff. There's a lot of deeper stuff within people, trapped energies, you know, from experiences and trapped. They need, like, the fourth and fifth steps. I think it's grand to talk about that stuff, but the energies of those experiences still trapped in here, and we need to look at other ways that to clear these things, because they're things like whenever somebody thinks about that experience, they can feel the fear trapped down here, and that's the stuff that's left over. We need to look at ways where we can look at that.
Trying to tell people what them steps are.
Well, for me, that stuff, the fear and the intergenerational guilt and shame that was passed on to me, right? It was so ingrained into me that I couldn't find a way out of it. It was just, when it came up for me, I felt like I was the worst person in the world. My life was over. There was no hope. I felt so bad that I just wanted to die, straight up, right? But I learned a way to deal with that through meditation. So through meditation, I learned that when this stuff came up, I didn't have to fight it anymore. And just feel it and surrender into the feeling and whatever's going on in my head. But I had to strengthen my awareness firstly, and that was through meditation, and it was through the breath. So every time I was meditating, my mind would go off into negativity, and then through a thought there'd be a feeling, and then there'd be a snowball effect of whatever feeling that was, whatever the emotion was. It might be fear, shame or guilt, whatever. And then I'd be spiraling down. But with the meditation, I was able to strengthen that and catch it immediately and stand back and say, okay, I'm feeling this here now. And from the thought, I feel it in my body, and then I watch it. And within minutes or whatever, so it depends on the strength of your awareness. The faster you catch it, the faster it's gone. You know, and there are things we need to start teaching people. They are the real things to teach people about all these different things that, like, your experiences are trapped in your body as energies. We need to start learning how we can talk to people all day long about psychology and all these different things, and they can learn why they feel certain ways, and because of their experiences, because of trauma, they have no self-esteem because they were told they were no good, you know, all these different things. But we need to start looking at the other areas and start releasing all the energy, because the thoughts are connected to the energies. If there's no energy there, a thought means nothing. It means nothing. If there's no energy, there's no emotion tapped into it. So I think we need to start really focusing on that a little bit more.
But again, I would, and I know I'm bashing the framework, but what that would refer to yours as being, you know, your personal capital. So the tools that Timmy has built up that will help him, which would help, as you say, many people. But I mean, there's all sorts of flavours.
That's what worked for Timmy.
And what worked for James was different, and we always speak about that.
And what we do on the podcast is we highlight all the options that people, Christianity, plant medicines, meditation, 12-step psychotherapy, EMDR, fucking everything. If you could find something that works for you, fair play to you, and best of luck with your recovery. But you have to find something, because if you just come out of your treatment centre and you think that's going to be enough, you're going to find it very, very difficult, and you need more in the bank for when times get tough. Because when people come out of treatment, early recovery, it's fucking great, you know. You think like you want to go on social media and tell everybody 3 months clean tag and it's great, you know. And you think like, oh, this is it, this is easy. Life is hard for everybody, no matter who you are. When life gets tough and you're 12 months, 18 months in recovery and you haven't done all that stuff, that we just spoke about, all this kind of therapies or whatever, you find it very difficult to stand still. So when times are good in early recovery, that's when you still have to invest in your recovery and fill the bank, because you'll be cashing in on that bank when times get tough down the line.
And if you listen to people's stories, they'll often tell you it's the little things that cut them out. You know, it's the having to go and get a bank account, having to get the shopping every week. They were used to managing the chaos, but it was the everyday life events that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back. So without doing that work that you're talking about, whatever mode or method you want to use or therapy, that's fine. But without doing that work, it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, I'm working with this guy at the moment, and he's doing exactly that now. He's dealing with the city council, he's dealing with the medical cards, the social welfare, and I was saying to him, like, you're learning the coping skills now that's going to set you up for the rest of your life. These little jobs, you know, making your appointments, looking after, taking care of your business, this is recovery. This is
life.
it.
This is life.
This is it. The people that are neglecting this and thinking, oh, I'll do this and I'll do that appointment, or I leave that go, they're the ones that's going to fall flat in their face 12 months down the line, but you won't, because he's taking care of his business. So it's so important. But you mentioned there something about neuroscience. Do you think different drugs affect the brain differently, and can there be permanent damage done that can't be undone?
Well, that's a bit loaded, but I'll try to. Yeah. So yes, there are all drugs, or most drugs, act on different sites in the brain that we call receptors, or you know, so they're like the key and locks
thing. The opiate with the pain.
Yeah. So they target different parts of your brain. So part of my PhD was looking at whether or not long-term opiate use causes brain impairment. So I looked at it in two ways. When we take an image, a neuroimage, we want to know functionally how the brain is doing and structurally how the brain is doing. And so when I looked at whether or not the longer a person was on opiates, in this case mostly heroin or methadone, because we don't really give buprenorphine. So I wanted to look at the longer term effects of that and whether or not that we could see a correlation. And not surprisingly, the longer you were on opiates, the worst state your grey matter was in. Now, in terms of my studies, I don't yet know whether that's, you know, repairable. But I would say that the brain is a remarkable organ, and that it has the capacity to, you know, recover itself from way worse things than drugs. And one thing that I'm really interested in is building this kind of what I'm referring to as a human model of recovery, because what we have is we're in a very exciting time in a way, because you know, we have this huge population of people in recovery, you know, peers in recovery, huge amount of people across, you know, Ireland and globally. And we know very little about them, but these are people who have lived with a chronic illness, with a chronic disorder, you know, like people that live with diabetes and they do different damage to. But actually, it's probably one of the only chronic diseases or disorders, I should say, that we have this recovering population. Generally, when we talk about chronic illness, it's a progressive thing and it's about management, but eventually it gets the person and, you know, they become worse. But actually, addiction is one of these really unusual things that we have a great opportunity to study the brain and the body. So another thing that's quite interesting is something called the allostatic load. Now it's two words, and all it means is the wear and tear of your body. So we all have stress and we all have resilience, and we take on stress, and as you say, Timmy, we manifest it in the body and we process it differently, and that's why one person's, you know, more resilient than another. So we have these mechanisms to start to look at the recovery of the body and the physiology and the recovery of the brain. And so that's really what I'm trying to push in my research group, as well as the health service stuff and, you know, the social piece and the environmental piece. I think that we're in a very exciting time for recovery where we could start to learn a lot about that. And you might say, well, why is that interesting? Well, it's very interesting because people want hope And when you can tell somebody that you've had years of damage on a particular organ and here's the recovery rate or here's the time to recovery, that instills hope and it kind of drives people along. And stress is one of the biggest indicators, as you know, to relapse. So if we can manage people's stress rates and know at what point they've kind of passed that, because we're still tinkering around with what's the sweet spot. Is it when you're 2 years in recovery, are you over the line? When you're 5 years, are you over the line? When do you become recovered?
It's impossible to answer, isn't it?
It's impossible, but I think from a physiological point of view, it's definitely achievable. And that is what would give people a lot of hope. And that's what we could shape things around.
So like it does, at a certain point in recovery, the brain might be fully recovered. So physiologically...
Might be,
I often question the damage that cocaine would have done to my brain, you know, because without being disgusting or anything like that, there was at times when I went on cocaine binges for 6 or 7 days with no sleep, that I often thought that stuff that would come out of my nose would be part brain matter or whatever, because it was so bad. There was a one period I must have used cocaine for at least 9 to 10 months, 4, 5, 6 days a week, you know, and sleep for a day or two and go back at it again when I wake up. And I look at, do you know, when things happen in my life at the moment, it's just small kind of struggles, personal struggles, kind of academically or just intellectually. I question the damage that drugs cause to my head, right? But I actually don't know it. I don't know the damage because I would have never been somebody that was educated in the previous level. Does that make sense? Because I didn't educate myself until I got into formal recovery. So it is, I'm sure everybody at some stage does question, what is the damage I'm after doing to myself? You know, I suppose you have to have some form of awareness at a previous level.
You have to know your baseline, don't
Yes, you have to know how smart you were to be able to say, oh God, I'm actually after doing a bit of damage here to my head, because before I was able to do this and now I can't.
I remember when I started out the education piece in recovery, I did a FETAC level 5 in the further education college there, College of Commerce, and I was so anxious about starting because like that I didn't know, like, am I after, no, you hear like scaremongering stuff like cannabis burns brain cells in your brain, and you know and I was thinking, well, what did all the ecstasy and the benzodiazepines, the Rohypnol, the Xanax, the heroin, the methadone, am I going to be able to remember the stuff? Am I going to be able to study? Am I going to be able to read? Am I going to be able to retain the information? But I found I was fine, absolutely fine, you know, and I'd say a lot of that is scaremongering.
Well, yes, and what you will have found, and I think you're good at advocating and pushing this message out, is that you actually got better. Like the way when you went to the gym the first time, you didn't, you know, pop a muscle, but when you kept on going. The same thing happened to you with your brain for education. You went, you had a bit of foggy brain, you had a lot of self-doubt, and self-doubt can cause lots of blockages and all the rest. But as you went on and you embraced that, you actually built your brain stronger. And you talk about a baseline, okay, you mightn't have a perfect baseline, but if you think back to yourself in school, which wasn't a great experience, and yet there's lots of what we call interfering variables or interfering factors, you do kind of have a baseline. You got cleverer as you went on. I imagine you're more clever today than you were 5 years ago. So actually, is that not a remarkable recovery to the brain? And the worst thing I think that can happen is, I think self-doubt is something that we'll all have. You know, if I do this, did I burn myself out? You know, I'm quite a stressy person, so I'm always worried about that level of stress and what is it doing to me physiologically. But I think the worst thing that can happen is the scaremongering and people writing themselves off. Sure, I've 20 years on drugs. We've all seen the picture of the 2 fried eggs. You know, I'm gone. I'm fucked. Like, why would I bother? So that's the bit where it becomes really important to kind of educate people about the ability to recover.
But sure, even people that have had brain injuries,
Exactly.
they still do physio on their brain. to get back. People that have strokes, they do physio. It's like what you do for a muscle. You still have to build it back up as a muscle. And I completely take what you say there. Like, if you have fried your brain for 20 years of drug use, that's even more.
Or you perceive it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but that's even more of an excuse to go into education, because you need to repair it back up. And you start off with your level 2, 3s and 4s and work your way up, like what we did.
But James, you know that giving yourself an excuse to use is the biggest way to keep yourself in addiction as well.
Yeah.
So if we give people, this scaremongering message and they think I'm fucked, like, why would I bother? They just keep on using on that.
Yeah.
And that's
true.
the waste,
Do you know, as an academic that writes about drug policy and all things related to addiction and recovery, do you find it very disheartening when social policy is driven by ideology rather than evidence-based?
Yeah, and I think that's true probably of every area of academia. Yeah, it is very disheartening, and where it becomes really disheartening is when we look to the US and we look to the UK and we see the communities of recovery there. We see the voices and faces, we see the big Ivy Leagues coming out with all their evidence, and still, and I'm not bashing harm reduction. I absolutely believe that it's a spectrum, and I believe that it begins with getting the help of harm reduction services, and a massive advocate for that as well. But it's the lack of investment and that education piece that I talked about that has to happen. Service, decision maker, policy maker, politician, they need to move away from that old metric, that measuring stick of treatment or detox being recovery and rehabilitation being recovery. Like the drug policy that we're all working from at the moment, supporting or reducing harm, supporting recovery, the current national drug strategy. I think if you flick through that, recovery, the word is mentioned about, it's either it's either 9 or 11 times, but it's very superficial, and there's very few actions aligned with that. Whereas if you look at the actions it's all about, and I've been involved with the festival drug use. I'm about to launch studies next week that will look at keeping people safe at festivals, drug checking services. So again, I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but when it comes to policy, you're dead right. We've got buckets of global evidence that we're not implementing. And we're not even taking on board.
Yeah, and even with that, the current policy document, it talks about, a health-led response, but in practice, it's actually a criminal justice-led response, unless it's down to it's down to the individual judge what they want to do. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that festival testing?
Yeah, so we did, again with the National Office, I did some studies. One was looking at the review of the evidence. So we do what's known as, when we take a load of studies and we kind of look at the good, the bad and the different in them, and we try to understand what it is that the evidence is showing. So that's what's known as a systematic review. So we did one of them, and what we found was that, drug checking services are wanted by festival users. They are something that they would contribute to, and they are something that keeps people alive. It's a growing public health problem is people dying at festivals. We've had 2, one of which was in Cork.
That's right.
And it's very unfortunate. So we need to do all we can to keep people alive at any level. But people want to use drugs recreationally, and we know that the majority of people that use drugs have no problem using drugs. They use them, they use them at the weekend, and they don't cause them any problems, and they go to work, and that's fine. So that is a population that we have to care about as well.
Yeah.
And so the second thing we did was a national survey. So we looked at people who were in Ireland who went to festivals here and went to festivals abroad. And what we found was that drug use was, always part of their experience. I think was in the 90%.
Yeah.
97% of people said that if there was a drug checking service on site, that they would use it. So in other words, they would go up, hand in their drug, get it tested, What would that do?
What's the legalities around it then?
Herein lies the issue.
Yeah.
So you've got different countries doing it. We've got the evidence that says it works. We've got the evidence that says people want it. But what we haven't got is the law that allows us to carry it out and implement it. Interestingly, and it's going to be released next week, and what I would say, because obviously it lies with the HSE, I would be hopeful that we will, festivals are on hold because of the pandemic, but I would be hopeful that in Ireland we will at least get a pilot drug checking service.
The practicalities of that is, if you go to a festival like Creamfields or somewhere like that and you had a load of ecstasy, or you had enough ecstasy for personal use, not a load of them, but you get into trouble, but you could go up and they would test the drug and give back to you.
Yeah. Well, so there's two types, front of house and back of house. So, and I'll try and keep it short, because so one is getting your drug tested while you're at the festival, and that's what people are most in favour of. Sorry.
That's fine.
And the second one is when you go up to a community service, get your drugs tested ahead of time. So it needs a bit of planning. You've got to buy the drugs, you've got to get them tested. And the big favour for that, why some countries choose that, and we're looking at the Netherlands and, that side of the world that favours this type, it allows people to have an intervention. So a bit like safe supervised injecting facilities, it's an opportunity to intervene. Then we have amnesty bins, and what the amnesty bin is when you donate a piece of, let's say, an ecstasy tablet, and that gets tested and it gets broadcasted then throughout the festival, whether or not what you're taking, what you think you're taking, is actually what you're taking, because that's what's killing people. They think they're taking ecstasy, but then they're taking something that's highly toxic and killing them.
Yeah, there was a situation here a few years ago. Remember, we had Cian O'Mahony on the podcast. His friends bought what they thought was cocaine, but it was actually a synthetic opioid, and they snorted it.
Fentanyl, yeah.
Yeah, it was fentanyl, and he died and he was only 15 years of age.
Jesus.
And that was one of the most tragic things you can think of, because it's innocent children sometimes are taking the drugs, but they don't know what they're taking. I don't know, like, I've seen it in piloted. What's the organisation in the UK that are heavily involved in the festivals? But anyway, I was reading a piece. There was this festival. I said there was 3 deaths in 2018. They piloted it in 2019. There was no deaths.
Fiona Measham, she did that piece,
Yeah, but then they didn't continue it after a successful pilot. I can't understand that.
Well, it might be the legality. So in other words, and it's the same thing that keeps the decriminalisation piece, which goes to the heart of what you said, is that the tail is wagging the dog. Like, justice is holding all the cards, and it's not a health-led piece. It is part of our national drug strategy to look at what we call nighttime economy, so festivals, nightclubs, and keeping people that use drugs in that space safe.
Yeah. Do you think that we'll ever get to a stage in Ireland where we have full decriminalisation of drugs? And do you think we'll ever get to a stage where we have good, solid, adequate recovery homes for people, aftercare services for people? Or is that, especially the decriminalisation, do you think we'll get there?
God, I hope so, James. I really do. I hope we do, is my answer. I don't think it's today or tomorrow, but I don't think it's 20 years away. I'm hopeful. Are
you involved in any working group, or that you can give us inside track on, or do you get invited to any political stuff like that, or are you consulted for policy by politicians? Or
yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of invites to that stuff, and I think Sharon's really good at articulating the notion when you're, a little bit earlier in your career, and you jump at the thoughts of the minister writing to you and asking you to go in a working group, and, you feel like you've got a seat at the table. But, I've said to my friend before, sometimes you're sitting there, but you have no plate in front of you. There's just no say. It's tokenistic. So I have been involved in a lot of working groups, the drug testing One thing that we're doing at the moment that I'm trying to do in Trinity is build, and UCC led on it actually, which is build collegiate recovery programs. So you'll appreciate this. You go to college and it's great and you're getting a great experience and, you're building your capital and all the rest. But while you're in college, there isn't this community you can draw on. There isn't this, other people like you. It's nearly like the NA thing, or put your head down, say nothing, and just get on with it. And America are leading out again on this, and the John Kelly Group and all the rest, on recovery pieces or collegiate recovery programs. So programs that build, campus spaces that create free, non-alcohol, non-drug spaces, houses within campus that are designated for people in recovery, fellowships that are given to people, or sponsorships just to come in because you're recovery. So that's one thing I'd love to see Trinity do, come out and be proud and say, if you're in recovery, come to us, because you know what, we've buckets of support and we want to support you. And I was very fortunate in the last few weeks to be made Associate Dean of Civic Engagement and Social Innovations. And I'm not giving myself a plug for that. The reason I'm saying it is it's now a platform to make Trinity do that, So, UCC, as I said, led on that piece, that collecting the data for they'll kill me for this now. Not my use, but drug use survey.
Do you know what would be cool? Like, do you know if there was a recovery society? Like when I was in UCC, there was societies for everything, but I didn't really think that any of them was for me.
That's what I mean.
But if there was when you were in CIT, if there was recovery society, you would have went, wouldn't you?
And when I was in the CIT, I did look out for some, particularly the maturer students, because the younger people are only finding themselves at that stage unless there's somebody really and you can see it's evident that they're destroyed from alcohol or drugs. But when I was out there was nothing really, I actually was going to ask them, would we be able to start an AA meeting or an NA meeting during the school. There's 15,000 people out there. I would have expected to have something out there, particularly when there's so much drinking and drugging going on within in college, and there's nothing there.
I'd say between UCC and CIT there must be 50,000 people. A recovery society would be, I'd say, amazing. And the way they have sanctuary scholarships for people in direct provision, something like scholarship for people in recovery, give them that little leg up, it'd be great, wouldn't it?
And I think there'd be a lot of people use a service like that. It might be something for colleges to look at.
I know loads of people.
And that's what we are trying to do. And if you were interested, or any of your listenership are interested, the kind of world leaders are Texas Tech. They're the big deal, but they bring people in on scholarship and celebrate the fact that they are in recovery and what they can bring to the college community. Instead of that, put your head down, say nothing, be shameful, if you're having a hard day, go outside. And then you're told you're supposed to be part of the college community. Well, you're either going to shut up and put up, or you're going to have resources on campus. So, that's what it's about, putting the sports in.
It's not something that should be hidden anymore, or you should be shamed of. People, a massive thing that we try to show people is not addiction is not a choice for anybody. Nobody wants to become a drug addict and sleeping, being homeless, and have a massive amount of charges and have years and years of prison. No one wants that. That's not living at all. But if these substances and alcohol are the only thing that's giving you some form of release, you're going to use them. It's like when we had Gabor Mate on the show, I was like,
I know, big win.
when he spoke about the feelings people get from drugs and alcohol, you get a sense of belonging, a sense of love, a sense of relationship. That's what drugs gave me, particularly ecstasy at the beginning, and I loved it.
You know, people use drugs for
You know,
one of two reasons. They either want to stop feeling something or they want to start feeling something. So you either want to feel less stressed or, you know, more relaxed or whatever the case is. And ironically, people stop using drugs for the same reasons, you know.
And when I say I loved the ecstasy, I loved what it made me feel. No, they're very, very, drugs are dangerous, without a shadow of a doubt. You know,
but they work as well, and that's why people use them.
And I always say it about what drugs done for me in my own life. They saved my life, but they eventually nearly killed me straight out, you know, and because I was completely paranoid and different things were going on for me in my life, and I started wanting to take my own life and all this stuff. But they do soothe people, they do keep people out of their thinking minds for a period of life. Whereas if they didn't have the substances or anything else to keep, you know, to block out all the shit that's going on in their heads, it could be pushing them over the edge, you know. And
yeah, we he mentioned Gabba Mata there. In October we have Dr. Bessel van der Kolk coming on the podcast, and then in April next year, I don't know if it's a bit away, but we have a fella called Stephen Porges talking about polyvagal theory. That's his kind of his theory. But have you any interesting research coming up, or books or projects that you're working on at the moment, or any interesting appointments or trips or advice or anything?
Well, a few things. I'm very interested in the health diversion program. You know, the trying to give people a chance that are going through the courts, and taking that health-led response. So that's something we're running in Cork.
Yeah.
And Cork will be the first kind of site to produce any data or tell people stories from that perspective. Another thing I'm very interested in coming out of Cork is collaboration with myself and David Best. We're building a recovery coaching model. So again, this peer-led approach, people who are longer in recovery, helping people who are, you know, up and coming. And we know that coaching is hugely successful. So Cork will lead out on that one as well. So
that's
I'm
through the Recovery Academy with Mark Wright.
No, it's actually you see, I think people blur the lines with that. It's not the Recovery Academy in Dublin ran a coaching study, but it's actually a Trinity piece, a David Best piece, and a Cork and Kerry.
And have you recruited all your participants for that?
No, and if you wouldn't mind me giving a shameful plug, I would love for people who are listening who are interested. So again, would you mind if I spend a couple of seconds?
Go for it. This is your opportunity.
So what we're looking for are people who are, you know, 2 years plus in recovery that want to give a little bit back. We're going to provide them with a training program and a mentor in the community. So what they'll do is they'll become a coach or a buddy to somebody that's in recovery, you know, only coming out of treatment. And it can be anything from taking them to a meeting to, you know, babysitting or whatever, showing up at appointments with doctors, just really walking the walk with that person because they've done it before them. But the protective layer is then, or the next call out that I'm doing is that we're also looking for people who are, you know, anywhere between 5 and 10 years in recovery in the community that are willing to become mentors to the coaches, so that we have all the layers of kind of protection in there, and people are supported, and training will be given. I
heard, and I might be wrong, and I hope
sure
I am.
You're not.
I heard that the mentors have to be 5 to 10 years in recovery, but have to be working in addiction services too. Is that true?
Well, ideally, that's the way the protocol is written. We're looking for, you know, maybe 12 of those individuals.
Might be difficult, like it's a very kind of niche, you know, like to get people in 5-10 years recovery and working in addiction services. You know, I can think of a lot of people that would be suitable but wouldn't be in addiction services, so then they're not suitable. So but I hope people sign up.
And maybe that is something that, you know, we can renegotiate. But I mean, I suppose just doing the feelers, there was a lot of people interested in the mentoring piece that I knew myself that, you know, were willing to kind of come on board. And I suppose it's about, you know, I'm not fixed on them being in, like it could be, let's say Timmy doesn't meet that criteria, but actually he's doing the 2 Norries. So He is advocating, he is contributing to the field, and I guess the being in the addiction services is linked back to knowing the pressure that the person is facing as a coach, what kind of things are coming up. So that's not the deal breaker, but we really are trying to get coaches to really help us build that model.
Yeah. And they must be able to be doing it as well for the right reasons, you know. Yeah. Must be for the right reasons generally to really help people and to get into a good place in their lives.
Yeah, but it's all voluntary anyway.
It is voluntary, absolutely.
But you get good training.
You get very good training. It's a huge evidence base behind it, and you get the support of the mentor, hopefully. And yeah, it's about, isn't it? It's about building that sustainable model, so giving back to the community.
The health diversion scheme is with Jo-Hanna Kelleher and Katie Buckley. Am I allowed to mention them?
Absolutely, they're the heroes in it. I only get the data. They're the ones doing all the work.
Yeah, so I'd love to get them on eventually. Maybe when we have some data from that, maybe like how it's run. But you might put in a word to Jo-Hanna Kelleher. We might have to get a judge on the podcast. Okay. We've never had a judge on the podcast. I think he'd be the perfect character, and you might throw in a word for us.
I would throw in a word if I meet him.
I've never met him yet.
No, that's the problem. I mean, I think the purse, the monies goes to the task force, but absolutely. Yeah. I suppose one thing that to give one plug that will come up in 2022 is the EMCDDA conference, and I think if you're interested in addiction and recovery, that's one of the great conferences because it's got everything from the biological, neurological, all the way up to the social, and that happens in October 2022.
We might do it in person.
Yeah.
And where is it?
It's always in Lisbon because that's where they're based. And I know David Best had postponed an amazing lineup of people. Keith Humphreys, John Kelly himself and Ed Day. So 4 of the big giants in recovery to happen in Derby. So he works in University of Derby. So that'll be coming up. So from a community perspective, that's the other thing I'd give a plug to.
Yeah, brilliant. We should go to that, Timmy. Lisbon. Yeah. There was a good bit of planning. We might get a grant off the council or HSE or something, you know, because it would complement the podcast, you know.
And they do sponsored places, so you just need to keep an eye on their website, and they do sponsored places, and you can contribute to things. So doing a podcast, I imagine, would be a great way to do that.
Yeah, book our flights.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah, but look, thanks for being a great guest. I know you're going for dinner now with Sharon Lambert, so enjoy that and enjoy the lovely weather in Cork, and we'll touch base again down the line for sure.
Thank you so much for the invite, and you've made it so easy.
Thanks for being Jo-Hanna.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to head over to the Patreon if you'd like to help us. Thanks again.